Hello, everyone, and welcome to this MHA Schools Masterclass on suicide prevention and postvention in schools. My name is Pedro Gondem. I'm Mental Health Academy's CEO and your host for this series. And joining me for this masterclass, straight from Chicago in the United States, is Professor Jonathan Singer. Jonathan, how are you today?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for having me.
Always a pleasure, Jonathan. This is not our first rodeo, but it's always very enjoyable. So we're really looking forward to the session. All right, so for those of you that are attending your first webinar at MHA, we've got a lot to cover. It's going to be very exciting, but we're going to start with a quick introduction and I guess a bio overview of your speaker for this session so you can understand where he's coming from. So Professor Jonathan B. Singer is an internationally recognized expert in youth suicide and social work technology. He is professor of social work at Loyola University Chicago, a past president of the American Association of Suicidology, co-author of 2 editions of the best-selling text, Suicide in Schools, A Practitioner's Guide to Multi-Level Prevention, Assessment, Intervention, and Postvention, and co-editor of the 2024 text, Podcasting in Social Work Education. Jonathan is co-lead of the Social Worker Grand Challenge Harness Technology for Social Good and founder and host of the award-winning series podcast, Social Work Podcast, which he was named National Association of Social Workers Social Work Pioneer in 2023. In 2024, he was inducted as a Fellow of the Society for Social Work and Research. Professor Singer is the author of over 90 publications, and his research has been featured in national and international outlets such as NPR, BBC, Fox, Time Magazine, and The Guardian. Jonathan, anything else you'd like to add about yourself before we move on for our housekeeping items?
I would just say that my practice experience has really revolved around working with schools and suicide risk. And I have an immense amount of respect for the job that teachers have to do. And so the work that I've been doing around suicide prevention really is in service of sort of allowing teachers to be able to focus on their jobs.
Thanks, Jonathan. That's great. Much appreciated. Now we're going to quickly go through our housekeeping items. If this is your first webinar with Mental Health Academy MHA Schools, please listen to this. If you've attended before, you might want to skip it. So firstly, you cannot talk during this webinar, but you can use the chat and Q&A tabs to interact with your peers and our team during the presentation and also ask questions. At the end, we will have a Q&A segment with Jonathan. So we've got some prepared questions and we are also going to take questions from the audience. And we're going to try to cover as many as possible. This session is also being recorded, and a link to the recording will be available via the event portal shortly after the conclusion of the live webinar, along with the presentation slides and a special handout with some links, resources, recommended books, and so on. You'll also see a certificate button via the event portal once the webinar has concluded. If you cannot initially see it, refresh your page, and once you click the button, you'll be prompted to complete a short evaluation survey for the session, which will then give you access to your PDF certificate. Finally, if you need any assistance during the live webinar or after, just reach out to our team via email or via the live chat. Jonathan, that's enough for me now. I'm just going to disappear here, but I look forward to coming back here for our Q&A segment.
All right, that's great. Thank you so much, Pedro. Hey, welcome everybody. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here with you today to be talking about suicide prevention and postvention in schools. I think that one of the things that is different today than it was 20, 30 years ago is that we have a lot of expectations that folks in schools, teachers, educators, school staff, folks that are, in the lunchrooms and the hallways that are, driving buses, things like that, that there's an expectation that everybody's looking out for the mental well-being of our youth, of our students. And I think that's a good thing, but I also think that it's challenging because we know that, you go to school to get trained, to be an educator, maybe you've got expertise in a particular subject matter, that is the focus. And then there are these other things that are expected of you. So my hope is that as we go through today's information, that you're going to feel more confident and more comfortable about the kinds of things that the field of suicide prevention thinks are the best practices for how to prevent suicide death in youth, how to promote lives worth living and a sense of hope and engagement, and then also what to do and how to respond in the tragic event that a kid dies by suicide. Now, one of the things that I always like to start out with is this idea that if we want a world where people feel like their lives are worth living, we can't have a society that says that some lives are worth more than others. And I think this is absolutely true when it comes to suicide prevention. Suicide prevention is not about what is happening inside an individual, exclusive of what's happening with their friends, their family, their neighborhood, their community. It certainly does not exist in a vacuum outside of the laws and the legislation that the government is putting forth, either at the local or the national level. In the United States, we know that before marriage equality was the law of the land, that LGBTQ youth who lived in states that recognized marriage equality had lower suicide rates than kids that didn't live in states in states that did not recognize marriage equality. And this was controlling for all other sorts of things. And so, that's an example of a time where you have kids who are getting a very clear message that because of who they love, how they identify, that society says that they are not, their lives are not as valued as others. And so these are the sort of larger level things that we need to consider when we're doing suicide prevention. And so one of the reasons why that's so important for schools is because students spend the largest portion of their day outside of sleeping in schools. And the environment that schools create, the environment that teachers and educators are creating, is essential in establishing not just safe environments, but affirming environments for kids. So Brenda Alvarez wrote that teachers and support staff know that welcoming, safe, and supportive learning spaces that are accepting of all cultures, languages, and identities help students do better in schools. They can also help save lives. So let's start out with some definitions. First definition, non-suicidal self-injury. So non-suicidal self-injury is the deliberate, direct destruction or alteration of body tissue without a conscious suicidal intent. Now, this is an important definition because there are lots of things people can do to injure themselves, right? They can overdose on substances. They can engage in disordered eating, right? They can do lots of things that can harm them, but those are not considered non-suicidal self-injury. Non-suicidal self-injury is sort of an immediate act that destroys body tissue, but there's no intent to die. So when you have somebody that is cutting or burning themselves, or sometimes more stereotypically for boys, there's a punching of the wall or a banging of the head, that these sorts of acts are done to self-injure, but not with any desire to end one's life. And this is a really important distinction. I've worked with kids who have been embarrassed about their self-injury, and they've been embarrassed because they're afraid people will think that they have tried to kill themselves because they have cut marks on their arms. But actually, they had never had any intention of dying. But the stigma, of course, of suicide is so intense that even for kids that self-injure, the fear is somebody will think that I'm suicidal. Like, that's the bad thing that could happen. I worked with a kid whose parents didn't know that he was self-injuring. And what they learned was that he was having thoughts of suicide. And when he came in to see me in the office, he said, I've got so much pressure on me. I'm a wrestler at school. I get so stressed out about it. Sometimes it's overwhelming, and even thinking about it off season, that I'll cut myself. And so he would injure himself on his arms and his legs to manage the stress. But he also said that doing that kept suicidal thoughts at bay. So when he was self-injuring, he wouldn't have thoughts of suicide. There was something that was happening with the self-injury, with the cutting, that was keeping those suicidal thoughts at bay. The problem was that when wrestling season came around, wrestling uniforms show your legs and your arms. And he was terrified that people were going to see that he had been self-injuring. And so what he wanted to do was to stop. And so he stopped, but then the suicidal thoughts came back. And so our work together was this balance of telling his parents, he was able to tell them himself, I've been doing this cutting, and here's why. And I've also had these thoughts of suicide. And actually the cutting, even though I'm not proud of it, it actually keeps the thoughts away. And so I don't want to stop. And so in this case, you had non-suicidal self-injury as a coping strategy for suicidal thoughts. So I share this for a couple of reasons. One, because it's an example of non-suicidal self-injury, but it's also an example of how you don't want to confuse non-suicidal self-injury for suicidal behaviors. They have very different intents, and they have very different treatment plans and sort of progress. Now, there are some times where you have people who engage in non-suicidal self-injury who also have thoughts of suicide. And, one of the ways that you can tell that is that if you're talking with somebody and you see that they've got cuts on their arms, and you ask about them, and they say something like, sometimes I get so overwhelmed that I'll just, cut myself, and then I feel better. You can ask, I'm just wondering if at any time when you are cutting yourself, have you also had thoughts of ending your life? Right. So that would be a way of bringing that content into a situation where somebody might be engaging in non-suicidal self-injury. Now, the second definition on this list, and I promise we're going to get through all of them, is non-suicidal morbid ideation. And this is thoughts of death without suicidal or self-injurious content. So again, I was working with a girl. She was 15. And when I asked her, I was working with her because she had recently made a suicide attempt. And when I was asking her when the first time was that she had thoughts of suicide, she said that she was 12. And we talked about that for a little bit. But then on her own, she brought up, she said, the first time I thought about ending my own life was when I was 12. But I can remember as far back as age 5 that I would look up at the ceiling and I would see the fan spinning around, and I would think, if this fan fell on me and I died, that would be okay. And this is an example of non-suicidal morbid ideation. So thinking of death, but not thinking of doing anything to end your life. Now, if she had said, and so I got a ladder and I crawled up and I undid the screws so that, that might be considered suicidal behavior. But non-suicidal morbid ideation is, again, something that we don't want to confuse with suicidal behavior. And so anytime you have a kid who says, I think about my death, I'll be driving home and I'll think about, well, if I drove into the oncoming traffic, let me back up. Not if I drove into the oncoming traffic, but if somebody from the oncoming traffic drove into me, or if there was an accident that I didn't cause, but I died, that would be okay. That would be an example of non-suicidal morbid ideation. Now, of course, if the person was like, I'm going to drive into oncoming traffic, that would be an example of suicidal behavior, because that would be something where they had done something with the intent of ending their life. So the next definition is the next phrase is suicidal ideation. And the definition is thoughts of ending one's life, which seems pretty straightforward. Important to remember that suicidal ideation can also present as feelings. So when I talk with younger kids in primary, elementary school, or sort of younger secondary, in the United States, junior high or middle school, sometimes you'll get kids who say things like, no, I don't really have thoughts of suicide. I just kind of get a feeling like I'm going to do something. And that counts as suicidal ideation, even though it's not a thought. We sort of count that the same. And so making sure that you're clear about when thoughts are suicidal is important, or even feelings. Now, there are a couple of different versions of behaviors that we talk about. So a suicide attempt is any non-fatal, potentially injurious behavior with the intent to end one's life. And so this means that a suicide attempt may or may not result in injury. You could have somebody who is taking a medication that you can't die from, right? You could take a bunch of aspirin, you could take ibuprofen, you could take, there are a number of medications that are not lethal in any kind of dosage that anybody could take. It would still count as a suicide attempt, even though there was no injury to the body. Now, let's say you had a kid who was taking medication, right? Or who had even pulled out a razor blade, right? And had put it to their skin, but not pulled the razor blade across their skin, or not made a mark with the razor blade. That would still count as a suicide attempt if they stopped themselves from engaging, right? Let's say they were holding the razor blade against their arm and then they put it away. That would be considered an aborted suicide attempt, where they stop themselves. If their parent walks into the bedroom and they put down the razor blade, that would be considered an interrupted suicide attempt. And these are things that are perhaps not so important to be clear on as a teacher, but they're important things to know about, so that if you're talking with somebody and they say, well, we appreciate you referring the kid, we want to let you know that they had an interrupted suicide attempt. And then you know what that means. It means somebody walked in on them at some point during the process of them engaging in their potentially injurious behavior, right? The last definition is suicide. And this one is the act of intentionally ending one's life. Again, this seems like a pretty obvious definition. And when we talk about suicide deaths, we are always talking about folks who have done something where there is intent, known intent to end your life. So the complication comes in when you have a death and the intent is unclear, right? Maybe somebody didn't leave a note. Maybe there was no social media post. Maybe there's conflicting evidence about whether or not this person was actually having thoughts of ending their life, or rather wanting to end their life, right? I live in Chicago. Chicago is the third largest city in the United States. We have lots of kids that have taken public transportation their whole life. They know how to stand at the, waiting for the train, waiting for the bus. And so when you have a kid that dies because they step in front of a bus, or they sort of fall onto the train tracks, the question is, was that intentional or was that accidental? And so the idea of suicide, even though the definition is pretty clear, sometimes it can be hard to make a determination. And in those cases, sort of the tie goes to the runner, right? They don't declare something a suicide death unless it can be clearly identified as such. So let's talk about some preferred and problematic terms. In suicide prevention, we talk about suicide attempts and suicide as the preferred terms. The problematic terms are terms that have historically been used, right? Even when I was being trained years ago in the 1990s, we talked about, a kid comes in after having a failed suicide attempt, right? Which means they attempted suicide and they lived. Or we would talk about a kid whose parents successfully killed themselves, right? These days we see those as problematic because the phrasing posits living as a failure and dying as a success. And so we don't do that. So instead we just take out those first words, right? So instead of a failed suicide attempt, it's a suicide attempt, or a successful suicide is a suicide. Now, the next phrase here, non-serious versus serious attempt. When you judge the severity of a suicide attempt, it diminishes the pain that the person who made the attempt is experiencing. If distinctions are necessary, and again, I don't know for many teachers, this is ever a distinction that you would be asked to make, but sometimes you might hear about it from folks in the medical profession, is that they might talk about low lethality versus high lethality attempts. And like I was mentioning before, ibuprofen is not a medication that is particularly lethal. Acetaminophen or paracetamol is highly lethal. And you don't hear about it much because the pharmaceutical company that makes it does not want people to know that the threshold between a clinically useful level and a lethal level is very thin, right? There's a very thin line between what's clinically useful and what's lethal. And so you might be able to talk about a low lethality versus high lethality attempt while always acknowledging how serious the attempt was, whether it was injurious or not. The last one is committed suicide. And this is a phrase that people have been using since the 1400s, right? When in England, suicide was considered a sin because people were considered properties of the king and of the monarch. And if you ended your own life, you were committing a crime against the king. You were taking away the king's property. And so the punishment for somebody who committed the crime of suicide is they wouldn't be given a Christian burial. They couldn't be buried in the church cemetery. Sometimes there were sanctions against the family, right? So it was seen as a crime. And that phrasing, we know from talking with suicide attempt survivors and suicide loss survivors that it's very pejorative, right? The connotation of crime associated with the word committed means that people say, you know what? It's enough to just say, my son died by suicide or my son killed himself. You don't have to say he committed suicide. And so these are some of the preferred and problematic terms. What I'll say is that these terms change, right, over time. And what's most important is not that you have the exact right language all the time, but that you are kind of being intentional about wanting to communicate clearly with folks about what your students might be thinking or feeling, the behaviors they've engaged in, the kinds of milieu that they're in with their families. So enough about vocab list. Let's talk about some statistics. Jerry Reed is a social worker and former head of suicide prevention at EDC in the United States. And he likes to say that around suicide prevention, behind every statistic is a tear. And I think this is absolutely true. So I'm going to be sharing some statistics, not a lot, don't worry, and not for very long. But I do want to acknowledge that each one of these numbers represents a young person who died, a family and a community that grieved their loss, and a whole bunch of people that were left asking why. And I think this is important because as educators, you understand perhaps better than anybody how important each kid is in a community, and being able to work directly, right, in a school setting, supporting a student's academic, social, emotional needs, understanding their peer milieu. Students might only ever interact with you, not a mental health professional. And so it's so important and valuable to have your participation in suicide prevention in schools. So if we look at global youth suicide rates, what we can see is that between 1950 and 2022, for most countries, the suicide rates went up. They went up, they went up, they went up. And then in some countries like Australia, you can see that there was a peak in the late 90s, and then they started to go down in the 2000s, slight increase in the 2010s. In the United States, we had a similar thing where the rates rose. They kind of peaked in the mid 70s. They went down, back up. But then starting around 2007, they just started climbing and going up and up and up until they're higher than they were at any other time. Other countries like Japan, they peaked and then they dropped and they stayed low. And so there's all sorts of different variations. We can zoom in a little bit if we look at the suicide rates for this 2013 to 2022 period. I mean, all this information comes from the World Health Organization. We can see that youth ages 15 to 19 across the board have lower suicide rates than youth 20 to 24. And in many countries, youth 25 to 29 have far higher suicide rates. Now, this is important because when we talk about youth suicide, oftentimes you'll see stats that aggregate 15 to 24, right? And it's important to know that it's actually the 20 to 24 range that has a much higher suicide rate than the 15 to 19. Again, every kid, no matter what their age, who dies by suicide is one death too many. But I do think that it's important context to know that the majority of suicide deaths happen after kids leave secondary education. Now, if we look at a map, global map, right, of 2019 youth suicide for folks 15 to 29 years of age, we can see that, for example, the United States, Russia, parts of Europe, they're all about 15 per 100,000, a little bit up. If we look at Australia, New Zealand, Canada, some other countries, right, the rates are 10 to 15. And then we have areas where, in Europe, the rates are between 5 to 10 per 100,000. So there's wide variation. And in the United States and in Russia, you get suicide rates primarily amongst males, and globally, actually, mostly amongst males, and mostly because they have access to more lethal means. And so, for example, in the United States, the majority of suicide deaths are with firearms. And because of the Second Amendment of our U.S. Constitution, it is highly unlikely that that is going to change anytime soon, which is tragic. So one of the myths that we often hear about with suicide is that people who are suicidal are weak. And what we know is that people can be suicidal despite enormous strength and courage. I saw an image online that I thought was really beautiful and expressed this incredibly well. It says, "Do not confuse my bad days as a sign of weakness. Those are actually the days I'm fighting my hardest." And I think this is a beautiful message for us as adults to kind of internalize, right? And it can be beautiful to share with parents that are wondering, why is my kid struggling? With our colleagues who also might be wondering, what is going on with this kid? Sometimes it can be helpful to share with the kid. Although I caution folks from jumping in with this idea, right? You certainly don't want to have a kid that comes to you and says, "I'm having thoughts of suicide." And for you to say, "Well, it seems like you're fighting really hard," because they might look at you and say, "That's not what I said," right? I don't feel like I'm particularly strong or courageous. I don't feel like I'm fighting particularly hard, right? So you want to stay with them on this one. But that idea that folks can be suicidal despite enormous strength and courage, I think, is an important way of debunking the myth that people who die, or people who are suicidal, are always weak. So why do people die by suicide? Well, there are lots of theories. One of the most prominent ones is by Thomas Joyner, and it's called the interpersonal theory of suicide. And one of the three legs of this theory is that people experience a sense of thwarted belonging, meaning that there is a group of people that's important to them that they don't feel like they belong to. So if you think about students in schools, right, there's students who feel like, I really would like to be part of this social group, but they don't want me to be part of the group. Or somebody might feel like, I don't belong in a community because who I am is not somebody that belongs here, right? So a sense of thwarted belonging with a peer group or a social group. The next area is called perceived burden or perceived burdensomeness. And this is where you have somebody who feels like they are a burden to people that are important to them. So for example, I worked with a girl who was a 16-year-old from Honduras. She and her mom had been in the United States for about 10 years. She was in high school, and her mom had grounded her because she had walked home with a boy, and her mom said that she had shamed the family because she had acted in a way that was inappropriate, that teenage boys and girls were not allowed to be alone together. And the girl attempted suicide. And after conversation, one of the things that came out is that she felt like she wasn't ever going to be the kind of girl that her mother deserved to have, right? She wasn't going to be this nice, sort of compliant, traditional Honduran girl, right? She saw herself as an American girl. And so there was a sense of perceived burdensomeness, that sort of her essence, her being, who she was a burden to her mom. And in her suicidal space, there was kind of a warped logic, which said it would be less of a burden for my mom if I weren't here. Now, when you have that idea of thwarted belonging and perceived burdensomeness put together, you get the desire for suicide. So, for example, with this girl, the thwarted belonging, her mom said she couldn't hang out with this peer group anymore. So she felt like she was being blocked from her friends. And then there was the perceived burdensomeness, and that together that created this desire to die. Now, the third element that's required is the capability for suicide, right? And this can be acquired through practice. So somebody can engage in self-injury to see, what do I need to do to actually draw blood, or how many pills do I need to take for it to be lethal? This can be actual physical things people can do. They can also imagine it, right? So they sort of do a rehearsal in their brain about what would it be like if I did this. When you have all three of these elements, what Joyner suggests is that these are the requirements for lethal or near lethal suicide attempts. So a lethal suicide attempt is a suicide death. And I share this because as teachers, it is helpful to think about which are the kids in your class that don't feel like they belong to any group, right? Which are the kids that talk about how they're a burden to their parents, or that they are sometimes in some way making it hard for their parents, making it hard for their peers, right? This sense of thwarted belonging or perceived burdensomeness. And obviously, if you have a kid that is engaging in self-injurious behavior that you know about, finding out if there's this sense of thwarted belonging and perceived burdensomeness, along with the capability for suicide, those three elements right there are important understandings for how somebody might move towards a lethal or near lethal suicide attempt. So let's get to schools. In our book, Suicide in Schools, we develop a model where we talk about three tiers. And in schools in the United States, the multi-tier system of support, response to intervention, PBIS. There are lots of different programs that and ways of thinking about addressing kids' behaviors at different levels. And so what we have is tier one, and this is where we think about universal screening. So like all the kids in a class, let's say all the 15-year-olds, all the ninth graders, all the kids in a certain grade level, they would all be screened for suicide on the same day. And this would be a universal screening, meaning that everybody gets it. You don't know who might be suicidal, and that's one of the reasons why you're doing it. Programs like Signs of Suicide in the United States are empirically supported for the education and awareness, and also screening and how to set up what they call the program days for doing this. The tier two would be somebody that has some known risks for suicide, but is not known to be suicidal. So for example, you might have a kid that you overhear in class telling their peers that they don't think they can make the party this weekend because they're not sure they're going to be alive. And that might be a situation where you want to check in with them. You would refer them for what we call targeted screening, right? Where they might get a screener that asks them questions about thoughts of suicide, suicidal behaviors. I'll talk about one in a little bit. And then if they say yes, then they get a suicide risk assessment. And then if they've been identified to be suicidal through the suicide risk assessment, then there would be safety planning, suicide risk monitoring, if they've been hospitalized, or reentry meeting. So all of these things are really, really essential parts of the Suicide in Schools model. Now, of course, as teachers, you would not be expected to do the screening, the suicide risk assessment, safety planning, or monitoring, but it is really important to know about what these are so that you can have an idea of what the teachers, or sorry, not the teachers, the mental health professionals or administrators are doing that will respond to your referrals, right? So when you are referring out to an administrator because you are concerned about a kid, you want to know what happens next. And these are some of the things that could happen next. So if we think about tier one in the classroom, right? This is all of the stuff that you know so well. Creating supportive environments, right? Building positive relationships, promoting belonging and engagement, focusing on resilience and inclusion. These are all things that teachers do, but they are also things that teachers can do that develop this sense of connectedness that research has shown reduces suicide risk. So it not only, and when I say reduces suicide risk, it reduces suicidal thoughts and suicide attempts. And so how do you build positive relationships? Well, you show interest in students' lives. You integrate social emotional learning, right? In the United States, we have social emotional learning that is either integrated into specific curricula or it is a standalone curricula. Everyday interactions, extracurricular activities, these sorts of things can improve belonging and engagement, right? And I know that in Australia there's a focus on resilience and inclusion, right, which is consistent with the health promoting schools approach used by the Mind Matters and BU program. There's also promoting protective factors in the classroom, right? So there is the thing that we do before there's a crisis, right? And this is integrating preventative mental health practices into day-to-day teaching. And this could be classroom discussions on coping skills, stress management, or resources. And again, these are oftentimes guided by curricula like the Signs of Suicide curricula or the BU framework. And these curricula are helpful for teachers who are able to then embed lessons around coping skills, stress management, bully prevention, help seeking, right? And you can do this without directly introducing the topic of suicide to students. And I think one of the things that's important is that people talk about, well, what's the evidence base for universal prevention programs in reducing suicide? And one of the challenges empirically is that universal programs such as stress management, bully prevention, help seeking, they're designed not to be suicide prevention programs. And so following kids for years to find out if the prevention program correlates with future suicidal behaviors is something that there has been little research on. But we know that in the short term, coping skills, stress management, building school communities that promote upstanding behavior versus bystanding behavior, anti-bullying programs, that these are helpful in reducing suicide risk. Now, recognizing students who may be at risk is, of course, a key responsibility of teachers, right? And this can be as not as simple, but as sort of integrated into your teaching as recognizing the warning signs for suicide, right? Because teachers are in a prime position to see things that are going on with students and be able to make a referral. Now, part of this might be that you learn about things that are happening on, sorry about that. I just skipped a whole bunch of slides. Okay. That are happening online. Now, this is an example of an image that kids have used online. And at first it might look like, you've got a green frog, Kermit the Frog, you've got a picture of a sewer and then a slide. And unless you know what this means, you don't know what it means. And if you put the words Kermit, sewer, slide together and you say it quickly, it sounds like commit suicide, right? So this meme says, I want to commit suicide. And so knowing what the warning signs are important. Now, I'm just showing this as a brief example of the kinds of things that you might see online that unless you know what they are, you don't know what they are. But most people, when we think about online suicide prevention, are not going to be on students' social media pages. It's just important to know about this. Now, there are some great resources. In fact, the Origin #ChatSafe resource out of Australia is a fantastic resource to understand and to help kids understand how to respond online when they see somebody who might be suicidal, or when they themselves want to talk about their own experiences with suicidal thoughts and behaviors. So those are both excellent resources. But what about actual warning signs? So there are lots of things to look out for. One of them is if you hear a student talking about or making plans for suicide. This might seem obvious, but it's one of those things that people oftentimes kind of ignore or downplay. So if you have a kid that you ordinarily wouldn't think would be considering suicide, and they say something like, nobody would care if I lived or I died, you might be like, what are you talking about? Like, of course they would. Like, you're amazing. Everybody loves you. And then you'd move on. That might be for that kid talking about suicide. And in that case, you would have missed it. So talking about or making plans for suicide, expressing hopelessness about the future, displaying severe or overwhelming emotional pain or distress. So all of these things are really essential. These are all really important things to consider when you are thinking about youth suicide warning signs. Now, any of those things, except for talking or making plans about suicide, but if you, especially with teenagers, if you have a teenager who's expressing hopelessness about the future, or displaying overwhelming emotional pain or distress, that might just be like a Wednesday, right? Because teenagers, especially these days, they have lots of reasons to question whether or not the future is going to be a place that they want to be in, right? But if they're experiencing these things, while at the same time showing these worrisome behavioral cues or marked change in behaviors, such as withdrawing from or changing social connections and situations, and that could include deactivating social media accounts, right? Or, of course, the sort of more traditional ones like stop hanging out with your friends, not being involved in social events, things like that. Changes in sleep, right? So if you have increased sleep, so somebody's sleeping all the time, right? Or decreased sleep, right? So you have somebody who is getting very little sleep. That is a huge symptom or sign that there could be something wrong. If you're an adult and you get a bad night's sleep, that can be problematic. If you have a kid that is sleeping 2 or 3 nights, 2 or 3 hours a night for 4 or 5 days in a row, they are not going to be functioning. So even if nothing else is going on, that is incredibly concerning. And then anger or hostility that seems out of character or context, and then recent increased agitation or irritability. And of course, these two are connected. But I like to think about it as you might get a kid that, for example, never gets upset with their grandparent, right? Or never talks back to their grandparent, or would never sort of be rude or disrespectful to a school administrator. And then they are. So if you have a kid that is talking about or making plans for suicide, that is talking about being, they're like, I don't really see a point in sticking around because the world is just so screwed up. And so I've disconnected my social media accounts. I haven't been sleeping. And I got into an argument with the head of school, or a teacher, or, I yelled at my grandmother, right? Like these sorts of things, if they are out of character, out of context, are really important things to look out for and could be considered warning signs, right? That something is going to happen, that this kid is going to do something in the near future to end their life. And so these are things that you can look out for in the classrooms. Now, another piece of this, you have the warning signs, but one of the ways that you actually get engaged in these conversations, right, is to think, when I'm concerned, I need to act, right? Now, Ann Moss Rogers is an American loss survivor. Her son died by suicide. And she moved on from being kind of a marketing executive to doing suicide prevention. And she talks about a 4-step process. Now I'm going to be talking about other kind of processes or things to do, but I really like what Ann Moss talks about. She says the first thing to do is to engage a student in a private conversation, right? You want to do this at the first sign that something is seriously wrong. And so those could be some of those warning signs that I just talked about. You want to listen with empathy without trying to fix the problem, right? So you don't want to say something like, well, I don't know why you would, stop hanging out with your friends. They all think you're amazing. Or, it might seem hopeless, but you have so much to live for, right? Those are not like empathetic connecting statements. Those are really like, I know better than you what's going on in your life. And that can be problematic. So instead, right, empathy might be something like, so you disconnected your social media accounts, and that sounds pretty unusual given how long you've been on TikTok. Tell me more. How long have you been thinking about this? Right. And what it does is it opens up space. It doesn't, it empathizes with them. It doesn't try to solve the problem. It lets them know that you're somebody that they can talk to. And we know that the more somebody talks, the more likely it is that they will be able to come up with reasons for living. And so this is really important. Now, if somebody says, well, I've been thinking about it for a while. In fact, I've had this thought that everybody would be better off if I were dead, or they say something like, I just can't imagine making it to my 18th birthday. It's important to be able to ask the question and use the words. If you use the words hurt, you're not asking about suicide, right? So again, you might say something like, so are you having thoughts of hurting yourself? And if somebody's engaged in non-suicidal self-injury, they might say yes, because I've thought about hurting myself, but never with any intent to end my life. And so you'd be getting information that's not correct. Alternately, you could have somebody who's in so much pain, emotional pain, that they might say, no, I don't want to hurt myself. I actually want the hurt to end. Right. But they might not include that last piece there. So they might just say no. So on the slide, I've got an example of a phrase that you could use. Right. So you could say, I've noticed you've been really upset lately and I care about you. And sometimes when people feel like this, they think about suicide. Are you feeling that way? Right. So this is a gentle way to embed the question in a couple of statements. Right. So you're saying that you've been paying attention to them, that you are, you're demonstrating care, that you actively care about them, and that you want to be able to talk about this. You are bringing it up, and when somebody brings it up, it makes it so much easier to talk about, right? Now, all of these evidence-based programs like Question, Persuade, Refer, QPR, Signs of Suicide, programs like Safe Talk, all of them say you want to use the word suicide and you want to be direct in asking questions. So this is not something that we made up for our book, Suicide in Schools. This is best practices recommendation. And if you're like, well, I feel really uncomfortable asking the question, again, that's the time where you can take QPR, you can do Safe Talk, you can do a number of programs where they give you opportunities to practice asking the question in role plays before you have to do it in person. So the last thing to do, the last step that Ann Moss recommends is connecting the student with help. And it's really important to not leave the student alone, not to say, wow, it seems like you're really upset and or this sounds really serious, I want you to go down the hall by yourself and go talk to a counselor. When possible, go with the student to initiate the conversation with a school counselor. This sense of transparency is really important. It shows partnership. It shows that people in the school, that the adults in the school are there to help, that they're going to collaborate and coordinate. It'll leave some of the fears that the student might have, right? If you leave the student in a classroom with the other students and you leave and then you bring the counselor back, the counselor, the kid might think, well, what did the person tell the counselor? like what have they been talking about? And what they make up in their mind might be way worse than what actually transpired. It also gives you an opportunity to have the student be able to say, this is what's going on, right? With you there, sort of a trusted adult. Now, one of the first things that people ask me about when I give talks on youth suicide, and I say it's really important to be able to use the word, is this myth about if I ask somebody about suicide, I'll put the idea into their head. And I always want to debunk it, right? And what's true is that asking somebody about suicide is not going to make them suicidal. And we know this based on empirical work, research by Maddie Gould and colleagues published in 2005, and there's been lots of other research subsequently. What the research has found is that asking people who have recently been suicidal, if they've had thoughts of suicide, doesn't increase likelihood that they'll be suicidal ongoing. And in fact, it seems to decrease their distress. Conversely, for people that haven't recently been suicidal, asking questions about recent suicidal thoughts and behavior doesn't make them suicidal and does not increase their level of distress. So there's only a win for asking the question. And so in our book, Suicide in Schools, the second edition, well, actually the first and the second edition, we asked the graphic designer to color in one of the desks so that it would match the color of the book. So in this case, it's purple. And the reason why we did that is we thought it was really important to sort of visually represent that you never know who in a classroom might be having thoughts of suicide. And so it's always important to ask. Again, that's that tier 1 universal screening that we strongly encourage. Now, once you have sort of kind of gotten all this stuff in your brain, this is an example of what our screening form looks like. And again, I'm sharing this because I think the questions are really useful. Anybody can ask these questions, right? Have you ever wished you were dead? Have you ever felt that you, your friends, or your family would be better off if you were dead or gone? Have you ever had thoughts of killing yourself? Have you tried to kill yourself? If yes, when, where, and why? Did you stop yourself or did someone else stop you, right? That's that aborted or interrupted suicide attempt. And how do you feel now that they've stopped you? Do you have a suicide plan? Yes or no? If yes, how, when, and where, right? So all these questions to be able to gather information about suicidal thoughts and behavior. Now, for our screener, we have information about past 24 hours, past week, past month. You don't have to worry about that as teachers. This is part of this more comprehensive model where we draw from the work of Sean Christopher Shea, his chronological assessment of suicide events. It's a phenomenal empirically supported model, but it's for mental health professionals. And so this idea of timeframes is more important. But for you as teachers, the important thing is to understand that you have questions about non-suicidal morbid ideation, right? Have you ever wished that you were dead? The sense of thwarted belonging, right? That people don't want you around. And then questions about suicide. So suicidal thoughts, suicidal attempts, suicidal plans. Now, if you're talking with a student and they say, either in person, in an assignment that you've given them, or in social media, I'd be better off dead. No one cared if I died. I have no reasons for living. If they describe a specific plan. What can I use to kill myself? Or they talk about their own funeral, for example. What would you say at my funeral? Do you think anybody would come? Right? Then it's time to act. Right? And so you could say things like, I'm concerned about how you feel, and I don't want anything to happen to you. I care about what happens to you. Thank you for confiding in me. I don't want you to hurt yourself. And then again, you can follow up with if they express that they have been having thoughts of suicide, right? You can say, I don't want you to die, right? So again, you can extend that beyond the hurt to the death. And then thank you for trusting me, acknowledging that there's no reason why they should trust you, but the fact that they did means that it's possible you might be the only adult that they have trusted with this information. So then after somebody's disclosed this and you're able to respond, then you want to do what we think of as immediate intervention and referral, right? So you need to be familiar with your school's suicide prevention policies or plan. You have to know who is the designated mental health contact, and that might not be somebody in the physical school building. It could be somebody at the district level or in the community, right? And so you want to make sure you're not leaving the student alone, as we talked about. You want to walk the student to the school mental health professional's office. You want to provide them with all the relevant information about what you saw, right? And do a warm handoff. And then you have to follow all the confidentiality protocols, right? And so this means that you can share information with the appropriate staff. For example, if they wrote things in an assignment, if you overheard something in class, maybe if there's a journaling assignment or something like that, right? You can share that. And by referring them, the student to the mental health professional and sharing the relevant information, then what you're doing is you are providing them with all the information that they need to then start doing the suicide screening and risk assessment that they need to be able to do in order to determine what level of risk the student is. And so by doing these things, right, not leaving the student alone, doing a warm handoff, sharing information, you're doing what we call in the United States gatekeeping, right? And sometimes gatekeeping sort of is not considered a good word. But in this sense, it's that you are recognizing that somebody needs to sort of go through what might be a gate, right, into a world of services that could be useful. And so you're doing the warm handoff, and it's super helpful. So what happens when you have a kid who is being referred for a suicide risk assessment? Basically, what happens is that somebody's trying to understand the story of how and why somebody became suicidal. As I mentioned before, that sense of, I'm not important to people that are important to me. I'm a burden. The sense of disconnection is big. And so giving somebody the experience that you care about what they are saying, you care about them, that actually in and of itself can be considered suicide prevention, because you're giving them the experience of being heard, listened to, cared for. You want to make sure that in a suicide risk assessment, and again, teachers are not expected to do this, but what can be helpful to know is that people who are assessing kids for suicide risk, they're looking for places where the suicide prevention plan can prevent foreseeable risk. And so Tony Pisani and colleagues out of the University of Rochester in New York in the United States talk about identifying points of prevention rather than prediction in a suicide risk assessment. And so, for example, this means having a good understanding of what might be going on with a student. Now, teachers know kids better than anybody else in a school, right? So here we have Alex. By the way, Alex is not real. I created him using Midjourney, an AI image generator. But let's imagine that Alex is real here for a minute. So let's say that Alex is a student that you know pretty well. You knew his older sibling who is a student of yours. Because you had his older sibling, you knew him when he was coming into school. You've seen him. You know a bunch about him, and he's in your class, and he has confided in you that he's had thoughts of suicide on and off for a long time. So suddenly that becomes baseline information that's really important for you to share with the mental health professional, right? To share with the person who's going to be doing an assessment. Because there's a big difference between a kid who has a long history of having thoughts of suicide, who is currently not having any more thoughts of suicide. They're not more intense. They're not longer in duration. Who has no more intent than he usually has. Very different than a kid who is expressing for the first time that they're having thoughts of suicide. And so, the alternate Alex, right, might be a kid that you've known for a long time that has never had thoughts of suicide. That would be important context to share with the mental health professional as well. And so that's why I'm sharing all this information with you to let you know that this kind of context, so that people can help understand the baseline experience of a student, is really helpful for the mental health professional to do their next steps, right? And so in the world of suicide risk assessment, we talk about this as risk status and risk state, right? So where you sort of understand somebody's risk compared to their peers, and then their risk compared to themselves. So what does a suicide risk assessment look like? I'm not going to go through all the details because you as teachers are not responsible for doing suicide risk assessments. But I do think it's important to know what the components of them are, right? So for example, there's spaces where you talk about thoughts of suicide. How much do you want to live? How much do you want to die? What's your plan? Do you have access to lethal means? What are some of your strengths and resources? What are some of the risk factors? How about the interpersonal distress that we were talking about, like feeling a burden to others? For teenagers, break up with a first love, being bullied at school, experiencing cyber stalking, right? A whole bunch of things can be considered risk factors and interpersonal distress. One of the pieces that teachers can be most valuable on is providing information about the school environment. So for example, if you're working with your student and you refer them, you can say, look, I want you to know that everybody in class has been really stressed because we have the major exam coming up. Alex is not the only kid that is feeling hopeless and despondent. He is the only one that has written a note about not thinking that he's going to make it through the weekend. And so that's why I'm referring him to you. But this idea that everybody's stressed, that is kind of consistent with what has been happening in our classroom these days. Or you can say, Alex has been really stressed out because there's this group of kids and we've worked on it in class, but that is always picking on him or is always teasing him when he gives the wrong answer, et cetera, right? So being able to provide that information is really important when you are making a referral, and it can be really useful to the person who's doing the suicide risk assessment. For kids, we also want them to be able to assess for the family environment, get information from the parents, and then also talk about how they presented at the time of the assessment. Now, what you see here on the screen is the end of the suicide risk assessment, where they assess for low, moderate, and high risk, and then they have this overall risk level summary. So again, teachers, you don't have to do the suicide risk assessment, but it's really important to know what might be going on in class so that you can best support the mental health professional to do their job. So teacher involvement in school-wide mental health prevention programs is essential. My friend Lisa D'Amour likes to talk about how mental health is not about feeling good. It's about having the right feelings at the right time and being able to manage those feelings effectively. And I think that the management piece is so important. It is so key. And it's not something that we typically have done a great job on when we have been helping kids to know it's okay to have your feelings. It's okay to express your feelings. That's fine. But we also have to help kids know how to manage those feelings. So that's where the whole school suicide prevention policies come in handy. Understanding, becoming familiar with your school suicide prevention policies or plans, clarifying your roles, procedures, and programs. In the U.S., lots of our states, we have 50 states, they now require schools, not all of them, but many of them require schools to have comprehensive suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention policies. And these policies are written with teachers in mind, right? To ensure that educators know how to identify at-risk students, how to refer them, how to eliminate confusion for like whose responsibility is this, and what am I allowed to do, right? So a key part of this is to know your part of the plan, right? Which administrator or support staff do you notify first when you're concerned that a student might be suicidal? How to document these concerns, and then what not to do. Like, for example, you don't want to tell a student, don't worry, everything is going to be fine. You're not going to have to go to the hospital. Nobody will find out about this, right? A bunch of those things, probably not a good idea to promise because you don't know. Maybe folks will find out. Maybe they will have to go to the hospital. So the suicide prevention policies and protocols are really important, and they provide a framework for teachers to better understand what to do. Now, there are some evidence-based curricula for students that I've mentioned, Signs of Suicide, Mind Matters, and BU. These are all programs that integrate education and awareness and screening and things like that. Another kind of suicide prevention is this idea of peer leadership and gatekeeping training, right? So sources of strength, living work, safe talk in schools. These are both programs that provide information for peers about how to support each other. Gatekeeper programs include QPR, Living Works Assist, Youth Aware of Mental Health, YAM, is another program that's been shown to be very effective in reducing suicide thoughts and behaviors. Now, there's another tool that I've talked about, which is the safety plan. And safety planning intervention was developed by Stanley and Brown. And it's not the only way to go. There is crisis response plan that Craig Bryan has developed, used mostly with military in the United States. For suicide in schools, the suicide in schools model, we developed what we call the home school safety plan. And what's useful about this is that it acknowledges that kids need to be able to think about how they can temporarily distract themselves from their suicidal thoughts at home and at school, right? So this says, what are some things that you can do to distract yourself when you're at home or at school? And places that you can go and people that you can count on to distract you. What's important about this is that in your classroom, you need to know if a student has identified something that they need to do to distract themselves from their suicidal thoughts, so that you can be part of the plan, right? So that you can say, I know what's going on, right? And it could be that they are drawing, right? They might take out a piece of paper and they might be drawing, or they are texting somebody or something like that, right? Whatever it is, you want to be part of this plan. And so if you look at the right side, about 2/3 of the way down, it says, will this safety plan or a portion of it be shared with teachers, yes or no? This is a conversation to have with the school staff, the school mental health professionals, administrators, to say, look, it's really important for me to be involved in this. Here's how I can keep the kids' confidence, and here's how I can be helpful for students, right? Ann Moss Rogers talks about, at the very least, you want to know for any student who's one adult in the school and one adult outside of the school that they can rely on. Obviously, you don't want to be the person that they write down as the person that they can count on to distract them outside of school hours, because you're not going to be doing that outside of school hours. And so it's important to have these two areas, these two domains addressed. Now, hospitalization is a huge issue, but I just want to acknowledge that, the week after hospitalization, especially for kids who've been hospitalized for suicide attempt, can be a really high risk time for reattempt. And so having reentry planning and having teachers be part of it, and school mental health professionals and administrators and parents and the students, having everybody be involved in reentry planning is really important. One of the things that's oftentimes forgotten about is this idea of digital reentry, right? And that is the idea that there is a life that particularly teenagers are living online, that if they get hospitalized, they're not having access to it, at least temporarily, because their access to the internet has been taken away from them. And so being able to work with them about things that they can do to re-enter their online world. And so some of the questions is, after hospitalization, saying, so what sort of things are waiting for you, right? What's it going to be like for you to go back online? How's that going to affect your recovery? How are you going to explain that you were absent from a community that you might have been really engaged in? What's it going to be like if you miss these viral trends, like you've been hospitalized for 3 days or 3 weeks? What's that going to be like? And so what we have is we have a reentry plan. This one is specifically written for American schools. So we have things called 504s and IEP plans, individual education plans. All of this can be modified for whatever school environment you have. And then we have a progress plan, which is if you've been involved in the reentry planning, how's it been going? Like if you were involved in some sort of classroom intervention with a kid, should it be continued? Should it be modified or discontinued, right? So you want to be able to meet about that and be able to talk about it. Now, all of this is in the effort of preventing suicide. What's true is that despite our best efforts, there are some kids who die by suicide. And when a student dies by suicide in a school, we engage in what we call postvention, right? This is intervention after a suicidal death to address grief and loss and hopefully prevent future suicide deaths, right? We know that a suicide death can have a profound impact on a school community, and it carries the risk of what we call contagion. Right. And this is something that exists almost exclusively among adolescents, where when a peer dies by suicide, peers who are already at risk for suicide are at heightened risk for death by suicide. And so this idea of postvention is an organized response to address grief and loss and prevent future deaths. Now, what we know is that research shows that postvention is effective in addressing grief and loss, including traumatic loss. But there's no evidence that postvention is effective in preventing suicide deaths. And part of that is methodological. If you have a suicide death in a school and everybody is jumping in to do their planful postvention activities, it is not a great time to have people agree to participate in a research study to evaluate the effectiveness of the intervention. It's also true that postvention is most effective when it's planned for and is respectful of the cultural variations associated with grief and loss. Different cultural traditions have different understandings of death, of what it means for somebody to not physically be present. In the United States, we have 560 plus indigenous communities, tribes. We have different, each one of them has different conceptions of life and death. and what that means. And I was talking with Sade, Heart of the Hawk Ali, who is a two-spirit elder who has since become an ancestor. And we were talking about this, and she said, Jonathan, after a suicide, you want to make sure that you're stepping into a cultural bubble without breaking it. And I love that idea because it suggests that we have to be very intentional about how we're stepping into a community sense of grief and loss. So one of the first things to do is communicate with students, right? Informing students about a death in a way that is sensitive, factual, while you're respecting a family's wishes about disclosure. You want to make sure that you are disclosing it in small groups, and oftentimes this is teachers who are the ones who are directly communicating the news to students. Oftentimes at the beginning of the day. And you don't want to do this in a large group. Like, you don't want to get all students in the assembly hall, in the auditorium, in some sort of large gathering, and then give them the news, right? You also want to make sure that you're using a prepared statement from the administration. If the death is not confirmed as a suicide, or if the parents have not given permission to call it a suicide, when you're giving this death notification, you can describe it as a sudden death without sort of hemming or hawing or going around, because it was a sudden death. And that's not untrue. Now, the reason why you want to make sure that you are not calling a death a suicide if the parents haven't given permission is that is being respectful of the parents' wishes. Now, the reason why you're looking for a small group setting is so you can monitor students for their reactions or their responses. Everybody will have a different response, and you might give the news and somebody might look like it doesn't affect them at all. And it's important as teachers for us not to judge them, because everybody has a different grief response. Some kids, the grief will hit 2 weeks later, or it might be immediate and intense, but then it'll slowly go back to kind of a baseline. Everybody has a different response. And so being prepared for that is helpful. You also want to make sure that, when you give them the news, that you avoid harmful phrases such as, well, at least they're in a better place, or they're not suffering anymore. These can unintentionally romanticize suicide. They can unintentionally give the sense that you are not a trusted person, right? For any sort of reactions. Now, one of the things that I think is really interesting research finding is that when we think about the folks who were closest to somebody who died by suicide. Oh, and this piece of art is this beautiful piece of art called Círculo Naranja at a museum in Torreón, Mexico. I was invited to Torreón for the Mexican Association of Suicidology conference, and I gave a talk, and they took me to the museum. And this beautiful beaded artwork immediately made me think about these concentric circles that we understand to be important for suicide prevention. So you have folks who are closest to the person who died by suicide, the family and the close friends, and then you have acquaintances, and then you have strangers. And what we know from research is that the acquaintances of a kid are actually most at risk for suicide. These are kids who might know the student who died by suicide, or rather know of them, but we're not close to them. And so what they're not seeing is the pain and suffering that the family and the close friends are experiencing from the suicide. All they're seeing are the memorials that are coming in, the ways that people are talking about them. There was a musical called Dear Evan Hansen, and I kind of think of it as the Dear Evan Hansen effect, right? Where it seems like everybody suddenly is coming out of the woodwork to talk about what an amazing person the person who died was. And this can seem to confer kind of a romanticization of the death. The folks who are most in need of grief support are the closest, the direct family, right? And so it's important for us to understand teen grief after a youth suicide, right? Teens grieve deeply, but often work very hard to hide their feelings. Sometimes it's because they fear the vulnerability that comes with expressing their sadness. Sometimes it's because this is the first time these feelings have come up and they don't understand them. They don't have words for them. It's not uncommon for teens to look for distractions rather than staying with the grief process long enough to find real relief. And distraction can include substance use, particularly for older adolescents. It can include making jokes. Sometimes it can be things that we as adults see as inappropriate online activity. And unlike adults, teens, their emotions can kind of flip on and off, right? In part because neurobiologically, many of them hang out in the emotion center of their brain. And so that can go in and out. But it's important to remember that teens can be kind of breaking up inside, but on the outside act as if nothing has happened. You also can see kids responding to grief and loss by turning into caregivers of family and friends, while at the same time kind of denying their own grief. So these are some of the ways that teens can experience or manifest grief. There are some gender differences that we've noticed, right? So all teens grieve deeply. Boys are often taught to suppress emotions, right? And Lisa D'Amour, who I quoted a little bit earlier, she likes to say that boys are given essentially a 2-lane road for their emotions. They can either get angry or they can stuff it. Or as opposed to girls who are given a multi-lane highway. They have many different emotions that they can express. And this could make it look like the girls are grieving more than the boys. But the research suggests that it's actually that it's harder for young men to show emotions because it's not something they've been taught or encouraged to do. So that's something that teachers can look out for, to be like, wow, it doesn't look like any of the boys in the class are having an emotional response to this. But we know that gender makes no distinction when it comes to experiencing grief. There are some benefits to grief support groups, and these are things that teachers can facilitate or they can refer out to, right? These can reduce isolation. They can provide safe spaces to share feelings and help teens realize that they're not alone. You can identify these common grief reactions, right? There's the emotional ones: shock, anger, depression, guilt, anxiety, helplessness. Like, how did I miss this? This was one of my best friends. I can't believe that I didn't see this coming. After a suicide death, you can see students feeling fatigue, difficulty sleeping, having headaches, changes in appetite. There can be problems with concentration or memory. Sometimes kids talk about having nightmares. And of course, all of these can impact how they're doing their work, right? So this can have impacts on educational testing, on assignments, things like that. Or socially, you might get somebody who just doesn't feel like hanging out with their friends, right? That's kind of how they're manifesting their grief. And so it can look like social withdrawal, could look like conflict. They're getting into arguments, refusing to go to school, engaging in even more risk-taking behaviors than adolescents usually engage in. And so this is where understanding the importance of being able to talk is really important. So teachers can be open and honest and available to students who are going through this. You can affirm sadness as a normal reaction. Remind folks that there's no one right way to grieve. Can listen without judgment, reestablish routines. Really important not to take personally teens' anger. You want to encourage teens to seek help, promote peer support, avoid telling teens to be strong. You can model mental health by saying, this has been really hard. I've started to talk to a therapist because I need somebody to be able to process my feelings of sadness that so-and-so is no longer here. And by doing that, it can make it easier to make referrals to professionals, right? And so if kids, if the students that you have are indicating that there's been dramatic changes at home or at school, they have prolonged depression or isolation, they talk about wanting to die, they're engaged in risky behavior or substance abuse, isolating, again, extreme anger or irritability, feelings of guilt that leave the teen feeling isolated or alone, acting out or risk-taking behaviors, skipping schools or dropping grades, right? These are all good reasons, especially after a death, to make a referral. So one final reminder here, right? Number one protective factor is a caring adult who listens without judgment, and often this is you, the teacher. Now, in the aftermath of a student's suicide, we know that it can take a personal and professional toll. You can have experiences of self-doubt, of guilt. You can question your professional competence. It's crucial that you have peer support, that your administrators are facilitating debriefing sessions and peer connection, that you engage in your own self-care, right? That could be mindfulness or journaling or professional counseling, or even going out with friends, right? Really important to make sure that happens. And then you might recognize that there's the need for systemic and policy change, right? Many districts lack structured postvention support, and having trauma-informed policies is important for future training. So I just want to end with this. As an educator, you talk and listen all day. At the end of the day, you probably don't want to talk or listen, especially after a day or two of postvention activities. And this can make your self-care hard, especially for those that you love. So thank you so much. I appreciate you taking the time, and I'm happy to answer some questions. I'm going to stop sharing my slides now.
Thank you, Jonathan. As always, very insightful. So much information to go through there as well. I'm sure everybody will be watching this again. And for those that are watching this on demand sometime in the future, I hope the future is bright for you. We certainly hope it is for us, right, Jonathan? All right, so for those that are live with us right now, submit questions. Any questions you may have, we'll try to cover as many as possible. I've got some questions here already, and some of them will be things you covered during the presentation, but that we can just laser focus a little bit more and cover some of the main points. And I'll start with this one. What are the most common warning signs of a student who may be at risk of suicide, and how can we address them early in the classroom?
Yeah, so some of the most important warning signs include students who are talking about or planning suicide, right? So that's when I was saying, if you hear a student say, you know what, I don't think anybody would care if I lived or I died, or I'm not going to worry about doing that assignment because it doesn't matter, I'm not going to be around, right? That's an important thing. Having a student who is experiencing extreme distress or upset, right? These are really important things to consider. Changes in a student's sleep. They could disconnect from social media activities, peer influences, all sorts of things, right? These are all what we consider warning signs for suicide. And so if you see any of these, that's when you want to act, right? That's when you want to do something.
Thank you, Jonathan. With regards to, you've obviously got a couple of decades of experience in this field, and when you first entered, because obviously suicide is a taboo topic, it's less taboo these days than it used to be, but still very taboo, and a lot of people are either not comfortable to talk about it, or they're worried that talking about it is going to create more problems than potentially solve them, and various other ways that we can slice the awkwardness of the topic. But what are some of the main things that some preconceptions that you had when you started your career in researching this topic and talking to teachers specifically, that you find that you were pretty wrong about the idea? And let's keep this specifically to schools as well. What are some of the most common things that teachers come to you and say, oh, wow, I did not know that. I thought it was the other way around, or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think one of the things, one of the big myths is that that if a kid really wants to die, there's nothing you can do to stop them. And what's true is that even though there are some kids who die by suicide, and some kids that die by suicide that we've known about and we've been working with, most kids who are thinking about suicide, even those who have plans, don't end up dying by suicide, right? That suicide is largely preventable. And this is an important message for any professional who's walking into school or at a hospital or wherever they work, is to walk in and say, you know what, today I'm going to do everything that I can right until the very last minute to prevent suicide, right? And so that sense of jumping in and being willing and able to do anything is essential in suicide prevention. Now, I will also say that one of the other pieces that is important is that suicide prevention is only part of what we're doing. The other part is life promotion, right? Is building worlds worth living in, helping kids find something in their life worth living for. And I think one of the things that's so amazing about teachers is that teachers can do this on a daily basis with their students, right? You can have activities where you're doing check-ins with students at the beginning of every week. Ann Moss talks about a teacher, a language teacher. In this case, it was Spanish language. And what she was doing is she would have students write about problems that they were having in Spanish, and their peers, and she would anonymize these, right? So she would remove names, she would remove some of the identifying information, and then she would scramble them, and she would give them to peers, and the peers would then write out their recommendations or their solutions in Spanish, right? So you had a mental health activity, right, where kids could get the experience of like, oh, other people understand what I'm going through, and at the same time practice their language skills, which I thought was so creative and so thoughtful, a way to intervene.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's great. Another question is, how can teachers balance creating a safe space for students while maintaining professional boundaries, especially when a student shares concerning thoughts or feelings?
Yeah, so this is really important, and I think this is one of the key things that distinguishes teachers from the mental health professionals, right? The mental health professionals, I'm a mental health professional. We are given lots of leeway to dive in and explore a kid's emotions and, that sort of stuff. Because we don't have to worry about how well they've learned, this chemistry formula or the dates for this historical event, right? We're not testing them on that. We're not giving them a grade. I think the basic stance that I've found is really important and really helpful for teachers to have is to say, I'm going to, over time, demonstrate to my students that I care, right? And that I care within certain boundaries, which is that I care and I'm going to pay attention and I'm going to talk honestly with you and I'm going to make a referral if I feel like I need to. And you need to make a referral if you've been asking the right questions, right? As in line with what I talked about for the last hour and a half. If you do that, then you're able to maintain your sort of teacher role, to say my role is as a gatekeeper. I'm identifying something that I see as potentially problematic, possibly life-threatening, and I'm going to make the connection to the mental health professional who will follow up with that, who will say, we're now going to address this. And so that, I think, is one of the key sort of frames of mind to have. The alternative is for a teacher to say, I can't do that, otherwise I won't be professional. And I think what happens then is you get teachers who then abdicate their responsibilities. And there are lots of reasons why teachers might do that. It might be because of lack of training. It might be because they're feeling like they don't have the support of administration to be able to do that. And all these are reasonable things. But if you find that you're thinking, well, I couldn't ask my students about this, it's not my job, you want to dive in about that. Is it not your job because your administrator said this is not your job, or because you don't have the training to feel comfortable doing this, or what's going on? So that at an individual level, that's important for you to figure out.
Thanks, Jonathan. A couple of questions about when a suicide occurs. The first one is more of an individual level. So it's quite common for teachers to, blame themselves or feel a certain level of guilt that can come in various degrees. Do you have some suggestions for teachers to both deal with that grief, that guilt, but also more broadly with, all the emotions or the common emotions they're going to feel immediately after or within whatever time frame it is that you see commonly happen as a pattern?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, like I mentioned, sometimes people die by suicide despite our best efforts, right? And in those instances, it is very common for people to beat themselves up, to question why, what did I miss? Did I not do enough? I think there's a time and a place for all those questions. But I also think that the thing that I was saying about, we need to understand that most suicides are preventable, that is a message that's important before a suicide death, right? After a suicide death, that message just lays into the guilt, right? Because you're like, okay, so suicide is a preventable health problem, public health problem, and I didn't do it, so then it's my fault, right? And so I think that the thing for teachers to be able to do is to acknowledge that they did everything they could, right? And that if it meant I saw this thing and I told somebody, or I followed the plan, or whatever it was that you did, acknowledge that, and then acknowledge that part of being human is caring about your students, and you would feel sad if any of your students died for whatever reason, right? And so allow yourself to feel that feeling, to get support from your peers. If you need to talk to a therapist because it's bringing up other issues, maybe you had a parent or a sibling that died by suicide. Maybe you yourself were suicidal as an adolescent. And maybe you were like, I'm not going to tell my student that I know what they're going through, but I kind of do. And then they die and you're like, how could I have let this happen, right? So you want to be able to, if that's going on, you really need to be able to support yourself, go see a therapist, join a group for survivors of suicide loss, because there is no easy answer to the guilt, the pain, the suffering. There are unfortunately millions of people all across the world who share that sense of loss with you, because they too have lost people that they care about to suicide.
Yeah, and it's I think within that point, there's two very important things as well to emphasize. The first is that sometimes you just get lucky with timing, or otherwise. It might literally be the case of you bumping into a student as they're thinking about that, and just a random conversation is all that makes all the difference, even if you actually weren't trying or weren't noticing that the student might be suicidal. So those events happen, and the same on the other way. Sometimes it's the other way around. You just don't happen to bump into someone, and there was nothing, no opportunity to do something about it. And then the second point is that everything you can do in the present is often quite different than everything you could have done in the past when you're in the future looking back. Do not confuse those things, because it's very common for people to look back and they start analyzing everything from a bird's eye view and thinking, oh, there's a list of a million things I could have done. But that is literally every day of your life. There's a list of everything you could have done that you didn't do, and it doesn't mean that at the time you were just careless. It just means that it's just a different angle that you're looking at things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are really important points. Yeah.
All right, so still with the suicide loss, from a broader perspective, school level perspective, what do you see the most common mistakes schools can inadvertently make when attempting to support both students and staff through the grieving process?
So one mistake is that they cut it off too soon, right? So that they say, okay, it's been a day or two, we really need to get back to class. We're going to outsource everything. Everybody goes talk to somebody outside of school. And then the opposite is also a mistake, right? Saying, we're going to let this go on for as long as it needs, right? So we're not going to have kids go back to their regularly scheduled classes. We're not going to have people assigning homework, right? It sort of becomes this very sort of mushy, time where kids, they need the structure. They want the structure. They want to be able to go back to school. I mean, sometimes kids are not too fond of school, but they want to get back into their routine, right? They're like, I want my teacher to be my teacher. I want my classmates to be my classmates. I have a role. I'm always the kid that complains about this. I want to be able to do that, right? I don't want to walk into class and worry that the teacher's going to be like, okay, so we're not going to do our work today. Instead, we're going to talk again, right? So common mistakes are not spending enough time and spending too much time addressing grief and loss.
Thanks, Jonathan. All right, the next question. Can you discuss some evidence-based prevention strategies that can be integrated into the school's curriculum or daily routine to foster mental well-being and resilience?
Yeah, sure. Social emotional learning is one of the key tacks that sort of label. It is about helping kids to identify and express their emotions. It's about feeling connected to adults in the building, knowing who to go to. It is about having the internal resources to be able to manage when to know that you can't and you have to talk to somebody else, right? So all of these things have been shown to reduce suicide risk in youth. In the United States, there's a program called the Good Behavior Game, which was not developed as a suicide prevention program, but is a universal program that looks at reducing aggression and improving connectedness to teachers. And it's for first and second graders. And what they found is that kids that went through this program were half as likely to die by suicide when they were adults as kids that didn't go through this. And again, as I mentioned in my lecture, the challenge with universal prevention is that they're not specific to suicide, right? And so it can be hard to say, well, this is a suicide prevention program, because it's not suicide prevention. That's the very definition of universal, right? It'll address a whole bunch of things. But being able to follow up over the long term and seeing what the outcomes are, that's when you're going to know. And so far, we have the Good Behavior Game. There are a couple other programs that have been shown to be effective. But those are some empirically supported things that folks should be doing in schools around having people identify and address their emotions.
Thanks for that. There's also the Ruler program from Yale by Mark Brackett, which also seems to be doing quite well. And I think they've worked with like 10,000 schools in the US or something like that. I've dropped links here in the chat for those who are live, but if you're not
great.
live, just Google permission to feel. And it's going to be one of the first websites they're going to pop up will be Mark Brackett's website. And then there is a tab there for the Ruler program. And for the behavior program, the Good Behavior Game, if you just Google that Good Behavior Game, you'll be one of the first results as well. You can take a look at that program. Very handy. Thanks for that, Jonathan. Now, how can teachers effectively communicate with parents or guardians when they are concerned about a student's mental health without violating privacy or making them feel uncomfortable?
Well, the rules around sort of confidentiality and privacy are typically that if a kid has disclosed that they're having thoughts of suicide, then there is no expectation that you keep that confidential, that you keep that from parents. And so if a student has said that, you don't have to worry about, oh, I'm breaking privacy or confidentiality laws, or even ethically, like, because parents need to know about this. But there are a couple of caveats here. Number one is that it is true that kids might be very upset with you because they disclosed something in confidence and they thought you were going to keep it in confidence, and then you went and told somebody. This is something that we talk to students about, right? We say, look, if your friend tells you that they're having thoughts of suicide or they're going to do something to end their life, we need you to tell an adult, right? We need you to disclose this. And they might be like, but they'll be so mad. And so we say it's better to have your friend mad at you than your friend dead. And the same thing is true for teachers, right? Sometimes teachers are like, well, I don't want to break this trust, right? I'm the only person that they trust. And that might be true in this moment, but it's also demonstrating to the kid, I can trust that adults are going to keep my best interest in mind, even if in the moment it seems like they're betraying that trust, right? And again, this is a lesson that takes a little bit of time for them to learn. Now, the only other caveat is, if you know something about the parents and you know that by disclosing that their kid has been having thoughts of suicide, that it might increase some sort of danger or risk for that student, then you need to think twice before disclosing to the parents. And so in our book, Suicide in Schools, we always talk about the importance of disclosing and connecting with parents as soon as possible. But if it's a situation where disclosing could increase risk for the kid, either for physical abuse, being thrown out of the home, being subjected to sort of verbal abuse or harsh criticism, things like that, then that's when the school gets together, the school staff, administrators, teachers get together and say, okay, who is the safe person for us to share this with? Now, in the United States, we have emergency contact cards. Those are the people that the school can just call, right, or contact without getting further permission. Most oftentimes it's the parents and guardians, but sometimes you'll have a grandparent or an aunt and uncle, sometimes even that there's a friend. And those might be region-specific laws, but the idea is that you want to figure out who is the person that you can disclose this to so that they can be the caring adult outside of school for the kid.
Thank you, Jonathan. One final question, and we'll start wrapping this up. It's been great. What are some of the cultural considerations that may affect how suicide is perceived and addressed in school communities? And how can we make sure our approach is inclusive and sensitive to all backgrounds? Question of the century. I'll see you in 1 hour when you finish answering this one.
I know. I'm like, wait, isn't that an entire another presentation? Okay, So one of the first things that's important for schools to do is to know what are the communities in the school catchment area, in the school district, right? If you have a school that has sort of observant religious communities, you want to understand what their thoughts are about suicide, about mental health, about death. If you have a variety of languages spoken, you want to understand what those languages are and what materials you need to have available in which languages. If there are differences in understanding of what constitutes a family, right? Is a family something that only, the people that live together in a household, is that the family? Or is the family something that is extended and is, could possibly be hundreds of people spread out over a large distance, right? So having understandings of these core cultural concepts, I think, is really important in suicide prevention. And again, it's important for all the reasons we've just talked about, right? So if you're able to reach out to a family member, and that family member could be one of many people, that's very different than the family is literally only a single person, right? That is the one person you're able to reach out to. In the event of a death, you can have families that say, yes, I absolutely want you to talk about my kid's death by suicide as a suicide. And on one hand, that's great, right? You want to be able to honor that. And in the United States, we encourage schools to talk about deaths as suicides. The research has suggested that ends up working out better, because then you can engage in suicide prevention programs rather than just saying that something was a death. Now, there are plenty of times where and reasons why maybe it's unclear if something was a suicide. Maybe there's some rumors. Maybe the parents say that they don't want it to be a suicide death. But let's just, for the sake of this part, say that somebody says they do want it to be called a suicide death. Well, you then have to understand how the different families in the community are going to respond, knowing that their kid was told your classmate died by suicide, right? How are they going to understand that? How are they going to respond? And so that's part of being culturally responsive. It's not just how do the kids respond, but how do their parents respond to the information that you're providing them. So I think all of these things are part and parcel of this understanding of the school as an essential institution within a broader community. And honestly, an institution that over the years has been given more and more responsibilities for caring for the emotional well-being of our kids without necessarily being provided the time, space, or resources to effectively address it.
All right, I have just a final little question, because I could not ask you that one, and it's how do you see AI coming up as a supportive tool for suicide prevention in schools? Have you come across some case scenarios where it's being applied and working well, or even case scenarios where it's been sort of an issue? So any insights on that? Because I know you've done some presentations on the topic and you're a bit in it.
Yeah, so I think when we think about AI these days, we're thinking mostly in terms of conversational AI, right? Or generative AI, the kinds of things like where you can chat with the AI. And I think that, we can think about those as either being tools or agents, right? And so if we think about AI as being a tool, I think it can be really helpful if there is like a grief and loss support chatbot, right? That has certain parameters and guidelines around it, so that at all hours of the night and day, you can get a kid that can be like, man, I really miss Mike. I really miss him. I can't believe he's gone. And the chatbot's like, I know how much you cared about him. You guys have been friends for a long time. His death was shocking. It's like, yeah, absolutely, blah, 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 right? So somebody that they can chat with when there's nobody else around. I think that can be, and again, that's sort of a tool that they can use. I think the challenge is when AI is seen as a substitute for any human interaction. And the reason is because there is research to say that our brains, the mirror neurons, respond differently to interactions with computers and technology than they do with humans. And so even if you have a chatbot that says something that's incredibly empathic, right? Like, you're in so much pain and it totally makes sense that you wouldn't want to go to school. It just seems that you loved him so much. It's so hard that he's gone. Like that statement, super empathic. Coming from a person, it means something different in the brain, right? Our sense of empathy, our sense of care, being cared for and held, right? Sort of metaphorically held, is different than when we get it from a chatbot, at least these days. And so I think that there's some value in being able to have chatbots that kids can engage with as a tool. I think it's problematic to think about chatbots as being the agent that they're going to engage with on a regular basis to address grief and loss.
Brilliant, brilliant. And one more thing that might be useful as well, it would be in terms of, and this might be something for more down the track, it's just recognition of, certain signs that might be somewhat imperceptible to people with students, whether it's their phone, their iPhone now can actually see what they've been writing, or looking at their eyes and their pupils, and all sorts of data that we don't yet know might in the future become available and kind of become part of the warning signs spectrum for suicide prevention. But that is a conversation for another day.
Well, I agree, and I will say that the potential and the possibility for real time identification, recognition, and response is enormous. And I don't think it should be discounted. And I think that people who are super excited about it need to be in conversation with people who find it horrifying, because both of those ends of the spectrum are essential in being able to move forward in a way that's both ethical and also has the potential to save lives.
Fantastic, Jonathan. Thank you so much. This has been amazing. For those of you that are live with us, check the event portal. The slides and the handout are already available. Jonathan, once again, thank you so much. Looking forward to connecting with you again in the future. If you've got any final words that you want to say to teachers, please go ahead.
I just want to say I'm so grateful for the fact that you chose this profession and that you spend every day inspiring and educating the next generation. I think it's essential, and I know that oftentimes mental health folks out in the community and even in the schools don't necessarily give you the respect that you're due, because we sort of see ourselves as the folks that are kind of the point people for managing crises. But you all are certainly on the front lines, and so I'm grateful that you spent the time with me today to hopefully learn a little bit more about what happens around suicide prevention and postvention.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you for everybody who attended. Watch this later on the recording. Take care, and we'll see you next time.